Yeah. So I was just telling that I'm aware of the high scholarly presentation of the previous resource persons in this FDP program. And of course, I will also try to meet the expectation of the organizers. But the topic allotted to me by Madam Professor Vismi Madam had to be decoded a little. I believe it is, two areas it should be covering. One is a question of social justice, meaning that it relates to issues pertaining to social justice. That is, maybe its definition, its origin, the various theories associated, its propagation, its documentation, etc. And the other part of today's presentation is linked to contemporary trends in legal research, meaning what are the latest issues, topics among the research scholars with reference to conducting legal research. Well, let me at the outset tell you that my major deliberation today, discussion today, will be on the question of social justice. And of course, last few slides will concentrate on the trends in legal research. Probably past 15 days or more than that, I have been reviewing literature pertaining to social justice. And I find that the majority of the literature is only on justice, the concept of justice. But when we try to zero down on the concept of social justice, the writings are not in a jurisprudential sense. However, I could lay my hands on around 3 articles. One is a document of the United Nations. One is an article published in a law journal, and another article published in Springer. While my views are expressed in tune with the main thinking on social justice in these 3 literature, broadly these 3 literatures. So let's start. Let's get set go to introduce ourselves to the concept of social justice. Whether social justice is different variable within the concept of justice is one question. Whether social justice, with its many uses and interpretation, what does it mean? Whether it has a basic meaning at all, or whether it is a universal. That's the first clarification that we may need to understand here. The term social justice, for most part of its discussion in the many literature, is a philosophical construct. In a sense, it is a political theory or a system of thought which is used to determine mutual obligations which flow from the individual to the society and from the society to the individual. So as such, we can say that social justice is a distinct and separate from individual justice. So when we speak about justice, we may also speak about administration of justice or individual justice. But when we raise this question of social justice, we are concerned with justice as a social justice as in a societal format. And therefore, we need to understand that the need for social justice arrives because at the basic level of the formation of society, there is some sort of reciprocal obligation between an individual and the civil society. An obligation which pertains to security of the individual, security of the society, and obligation in return from the individual to the state or to the society, with reference to fulfilling his part of the obligation, maybe like something like paying a tax. So beyond these general meaning of social justice, we may say here that there is no absolute, generally agreed definition of as to what constitutes social justice. Even for that matter, the concept of justice itself, the definition of the concept of justice itself is not an agreeable matter. So that being the case, we need to understand that social justice is an arrangement of an environment, an arrangement of institution in an environment which ensures that individuals, groups, and organizations who make up the society act in a just manner, act in a manner in complying with certain rules which are absolute, which are true, which are universal, etc. So what we find here is that in a pluralistic society, the problem is with the pluralistic society, the problems of pluralistic society, the problems of defining social justice in a pluralistic society. A pluralistic democracy like India. The problem here is, with reference to social justice, it must accommodate the diverse points of view on what mutual obligation exists, what rules for the governance of mutual obligation should be codified, and how the limited resources should be distributed. So there are basically two problems here. The first one is, how do we agree to a certain basic conception of social justice so that it caters to the needs of diverse set of individuals and groups? That's the first problem. Secondly, there is a problem of how to organize these social institutions in accordance with the prevailing notions of social justice. Now, if you look back on the making of the Constitution of India itself, the Constituent Assembly had to agree upon a conception of social justice which is mutually recognized and acknowledged by diverse individuals. These diverse individuals who constituted the Constituent Assembly represented the diverse population of this nation. And therefore, once having recognized that the Constitution was enacted as a social institution, the preamble is a reflection of that agreement. Fine. Now, the second question that we need to answer insofar as social justice is concerned is, when did the conversation begin? At which point in time of history did the conversation begin on social justice? Our major discourse as law students, teachers, researchers has been to look upon the Western model of justice, whether it is Plato, Aristotle, our Confucius from China, Immanuel Kant, Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, all had conversation on justice, but there was never a conversation on social justice. Furthermore, we find that in recent times, in the 20th century, John Rawls attempted to, I said attempted to because Amartya Sen and many others have criticized his conception of social justice. John Rawls attempted to converse or put his thoughts on social justice by identifying two principles of justice, as all of you know. He says that these two principles should be applied to the basic structure of society and we should govern the assignments of rights and duties and regulate the distribution of social and economic advantages. What are these two principles, he said? He said the first principle is each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So liberty is the first principle, the principle of liberty. All in a society must have liberty, all kinds of liberty of thought, of action. The second principle was, the second principle of justice or social justice within brackets we can put, was that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged, that they are both to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, consistent with just savings principle. The second part of the second principle is, and these inequalities to be attached to the offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So what we find, what we can deduce from John Rawls is that he was setting out two principles. First principle is the principle of liberty. The second principle is the principle of difference. The difference in the sense that inequalities in the society are maintainable as long as it benefits even the least advantaged group. And when you create certain privileges by rules in a society, those privileges must be attainable by all sections of the society. So he's just giving an idea of social justice. And this is, let me tell you, that this is much later to what the Indian philosophers thought. I'll come to that in a little bit of time from now. Next slide, probably. So my submission here is that the key Western philosophers, whether it is Plato or Aristotle, only spoke about justice or right things, or spoke about virtues or qualities, or maybe they spoke about utilitarianism or libertarianism, including John Rawls. But the first seed, the first conversation, which ultimately gave birth to the idea of social justice, according to me, may be credited to the French Revolution in the later 1800s, 1770 onwards. And it created three important concepts, which were then later used by other philosophers to conceptualize social justice. And these three words, liberty, equality, fraternity, these three words triggered enormous enthusiasm for all later philosophers. So various revolutions that were brought upon was as a result of these three important concepts. So following the revolutions that shook Europe in the mid-1800s, social justice became a rallying cry for all progressive thinkers and political activists. Therefore, I said in the beginning that the concept of justice or social justice in particular is a philosophical content loaded with political statement. Another identifying factor which contributed to the conversation on social justice is industrial revolution. Literatures have indicated that industrial revolution brought about a kind of exploitation by the capitalist, which created inequalities in the income of the people, inequalities in sharing the social development of a particular society. So now the society was organized into haves and have-nots. The society was now organized into capital and labor, giving rise to mass inequalities. So literature points out that industrial revolution and its negative impact on the society, on the lives of people, resulted in philosophers later on, including the Western philosophers, speaking about social justice. Most importantly, industrial revolution, after the French Revolution, this idea of liberty, equality, fraternity gave birth to many socialistic democratic governments. So with the establishment of socialistic democratic governments at different parts of the universe, the gradual withdrawal of the colonial master gave rise to institutionalizing the concept of social justice. As we know, by the mid-20th century, the concept of social justice had become a central point in almost all ideologies. I just now spoke about the Western thought on justice or on social justice. Now let us concentrate on, contrast this with the Indian philosophical conversation on social justice. The Indian philosophical conversation on social justice started much earlier to the Western thought of social justice. And Indian philosophy is extremely wide and varied. There is no one Indian philosophy which you can attribute for the contribution towards the concept of social justice. Now, if you look at the Indian ethical codes, like the Dharma Shastras, the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, with part of the Mahabharata, and the manner in which various sons, philosophers propagated certain values which were sometimes theological, etymological, on religion, on spiritualism. Nevertheless, the latter part of the discourse on social justice somehow synthesized all these things. Now, be it Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, many like them, we find that social justice has been there in their thoughts. If you take the earliest one, the Buddhism, of course, did not directly speak anything about, did not directly converse anything on social justice, but it only spoke about right action. So if you further interpret, you may say right actions may lead to justice, justice may lead to social justice. Similarly, Jainism spoke about bodily and mental virtues, about the dharmas that seem to entail the recognition of social justice, among them forgiveness, humility, truthfulness, straightforwardness, cleanliness, self-restraint, and charitableness. Of course, these teachings of Jainism may not directly be converted into the modern aspects of social justice. Nevertheless, I'm trying to give you an idea that even much before the Western philosopher could concretely come into the conception in social justice, we already had our share on it. As I said, that the common masses in India welcomed the new religion which preached peace, social equality, simple living. People wanted relief from problems they earned for living a peaceful life. So modern social reformer conversation on social justice can be attributed, as I said earlier, to Raja Ram Mohan Roy, to Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, to Jyotiba Phule, to Swami Vivekananda, to Narayan Guru, to Periyar, and to Dr. Ambedkar, who fought against the sati system, the child marriage system, the caste discrimination, women's education. So each one of them were influenced by the kind of education that they received. So I have to say here that education played an important part in contributing to the Indian concept of social justice. The credit of institutionalizing, putting it in an institutional format, the format of institutional justice in a format goes to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Of course, did not propound any specific kind of or theory of social justice, but from his writings, we can say that he was in favor of establishing an open and a just social order. So Dr. Ambedkar's theory of social justice, which the 5 principles that which we may obtain, cull out from his writings are like these. Now, each one of these have an impact on social justice, the way it is today practiced under the Constitution, under various legislation. Establishing a society where individual becomes the means of all social purposes. Establishment of a society based on equality, liberty, and fraternity. The preamble. Establishing democracy, which is political, economic, and social. A democratic polity. An economic democracy. A social democracy. Establishing democracy through constitutional measures. Most important. And establishing democracy by breaking the control of the upper strata on political power. That was most important. So going by the principles of Ambedkar's theory of social justice, Dr. Ambedkar was of the opinion that social justice can be dispensed in a free social order in which an individual is end in itself. Associated life between members of society must be regarded by consideration founded on liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this conception of justice, which was built upon individual care, upon individual right, is transformed in Indian context by Dr. Ambedkar and others by stating that it can be dispensed in a free social order where an individual practices the essence of social justice in all his associated life with other people in the society. And the central point in this associated life is of liberty, equality, fraternity. Yeah. As I said earlier, that the concept of social justice now came to be legitimized as a central part of concept of justice itself. Earlier, whether it is Plato, Aristotle, or J.S. Mill, or Immanuel Kant, Bentham, there's only the notion of justice. But by the mid-20th centuries, this concept of social justice had become central to the ideologies and programs of virtually all the governments, leftist and centrist political parties around the world. And no one dared to oppose it. So social justice represented the reason for social democratic governments. Rise and yet for social democratic doctrine, and it has left its mark after the Second World War. Now, of particular importance in this context is that there is now a link between the legitimization of the concept of social justice on the one hand and the emergence of social sciences, including law, as a distinct areas of activity, and the creation of economics and sociology as a discipline separate from philosophy. Because when justice was spoken about before it was institutionalized, it was only a moral philosophy. Now, when we discuss the concept of dynamics of law as per natural law theory, it is all moral universal principle. When it was preached by great philosophers, it was only thought about moral philosophical principle. But now, with the establishment of democratic government, it became the main theme of governance. Social justice became the main theme of governance. So the application of social justice requires that the sociological, political, and cultural framework between individuals and group are understood and assessed and characterized as just or unjust. So any system of social justice will be considered as just and unjust, depending upon what sort of a political, sociological, cultural framework has been provided for the individuals to interact between themselves. Yeah. The application of social justice is contextual in the sense So far, I have not arrived at a conclusion that social justice is a universal concept. Maybe in the later slides, we will see how it could become a universal concept. But the question of social justice at this point of time is to be considered as contextual, in the sense that it requires a geographical setup, a sociological setup, a political and cultural framework setup. In this particular kind of a setup, the country, the nation, typically represents the context in which various aspects of social justice are discussed. And at the same time, there is also a clear universal dimension to social justice, because humanity is the common factor of all social justice systems. Isn't it so? I said, in its implication, in its contextualization, country, geographical part, the society, the political framework, social justice could be understood. How in the Indian system, how in the Western system, within the legal framework, what is the kind of system that they have. But then, we also have to understand that if at all we have to elevate this universality of social justice as a concept, then the point is that we must consider that the human being is the common factor in the social justice system. As I said, if you consider human being as a central point of social justice, obviously, this universality has taken an added depth and relevance as the physical and cultural distance between the world's people has effectively shrunk. Technology. Thoughts are flying through technology. Ideas are flying through technology. So the distance has shrunk, and therefore the universality becomes the center point of discussion of social justice. Now, when we talk about domestic workers, when we talk about unorganized workers, I'm just picking a few examples which are universal in nature. Migrant workers, especially COVID-19, remember the rights of the third gender, huge debate in India on that. These constituent elements of human identification as domestic worker, as migrant workers, as the other gender, etc., are having national and global dimension for the purpose of social justice. Well, let's move ahead to understand what are the claims of social justice. So far, we were trying to discuss when did the conversation on social justice begin. My submission was that the conversation on social justice is a recent phenomena. Whether you attribute it to the French Revolution, whether you attribute it to the capitalist exploitation aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, or whether you attribute to the societal differences, pluralistic societal differences in a country like India. We tried to answer that question. And my point was that the Western conception of justice did not have an element of social justice until the writings of John Rawls. But insofar as the Indian conception of social justice is concerned, though it might not have been said in so many words, but Buddhism, Jainism, and other Dharma Shastras, etc., have said something about duty, said something about nyaya, so duty or nyaya, and later on its propagation in the backdrop of liberty, equality, fraternity by various social reformers, including that of Dr. Ambedkar, institutionalized the conversation on social justice into a constitution, into the Constitution of India. Now, what are the claims of social justice? What does does it want? Well, the research conducted by United Nations group submits that there are three basic claims on social justice, of social justice: equality of rights, equality of opportunities. Hello? Am I audible? I think the power went off.
Yes.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, because the power went off here. Equality of rights, equality of opportunities, equality in living conditions. Let us take one by one to understand how these three claims of social justice play an important role in the fulfillment of the goals of social justice. There are three elements here: the process, the goals, and the product. We have to see to these three elements. We have not yet discussed the process, but we are trying to reach the goals. The goals, the claims of social justice: equality of rights, equality of opportunities, equality in living conditions. Equality of rights, primarily, which means that equality of rights is a claim based on the presumption of inequality in the distribution of rights, or very specifically in the elimination of all forms of discrimination and respect for the fundamental freedoms and civil and political rights of all individuals. This represents the most fundamental form of equality. One of the earliest conventions of the International Labour Organization was based upon the respect of the fundamental freedoms and elimination of discrimination. The anti-slavery law, 1929-1930, is when slaves were traded off. The law on anti-slavery symbolized that all human beings have equal rights. Whether it is slaverism, whether it was the fight by Mahatma Gandhi when he was thrown out of the train, when he fought for the blacks, or whether it is Dr. Ambedkar, who in India fought for equality of rights of all classes of society, especially depressed classes of society. So that is the first foundation claim of social justice. Equality of opportunities. Equality of opportunities, which requires stable social, economic, cultural, and political conditions. The Constitution is trying to create a condition where stability is there, a stable social condition, an economic condition, a cultural condition, a political condition, which will enable all individuals to fulfill their potential and contribute to the economy and to the society. So now, the claims of social justice is not only individual. Ultimately, the claims of social justice is for the sake of contribution to the society. Interpreted restrictively, this form of equality is like equality of rights, and simply means that societies and governments refrain from discrimination and allow individuals to freely pursue their aspirations and develop and apply their talents within the moral and legal limits imposed by respect for the freedom of others. Fundamental rights is an example. The fundamental rights guarantee to the citizens of India is a guarantee of freedom to pursue their interests on the basis of equality of opportunity. Yeah. Now, the third component is equity in living conditions. Now, the document changes from the word equality to the equity. Why? Equity in living conditions for all individuals and households. This concept is understood to reflect a contextuality determined as acceptable. Now, there are certain acceptable range of inequalities in income. Within that inequalities of income, there must be equity in the sense of income, wealth, and other aspects of life in society, with the presumption of general agreement with regard to what is just or fair or equitable at any point of time, or in any particular community, or in the whole world, as a whole of universal norms are applied on this. So equity in living means that the living conditions are such that each, according to his income or wealth, has an acceptable living condition. I'm not talking about same wages for all, same type of housing conditions for all. Within the acceptable limits of universality, the social structure must evolve such laws which could provide for these basic living conditions. Therefore, it is equity and not equality. So the shift in terms from equality to equity, as per the document, is derived from the fact that equality in living condition has never been achieved. You cannot have the same set of house, the same set of salary in practice, because that is a theory connected with a morals describing that everyone should earn, like in a communist country, for example. But having given the freedom to earn an income, having given an opportunity to be equal, then it is left to the individual concerned to have a living condition of its choice. But then what it tries to say is that there is a mandate on the government to provide for basic facilities like roti, kapada or makan, house, food, shelter and clothing. To that extent, it establishes equity. I think I've discussed this next. Now, the next relevant point for our discussion is social justice equivalent of distributive justice? And we are asking several questions now because Dr. Vishnu Madam has given me several questions for me to answer. So I have myself raised this question and trying to answer. Is it equivalent to distributive justice? In the contemporary context, social justice is typically taken to mean the distributive justice. Social justice is equated with distributive justice. These terms are generally understood to be synonymous and interchangeable in both common parlance and in the language of international relations. Now, equitable justice may imply equivalent of social justice may imply, which is distributive justice, in the sense that the resources available at the disposal of the society is equally distributed for all, so that equality of opportunity is met out, so that equality in living condition is met out, so that equality of rights is met out. In that context, social justice may be equated with distributive justice or redistributive justice also. Now, coming to economic justice, whether we can consider economic justice as a component of social justice is another question. Despite Richard Posner's theory on economic analysis of law, notwithstanding, where he says that every legislation, every law, ultimately, every rule must have the economic benefit derived from that particular action. Despite that, social justice, in the context of economic justice, is defined as the existence of opportunities for meaningful work and employment and dispensation of fair rewards for the productive activities of individuals, which is treated as an aspect of social justice. Your law pertaining to employment of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Act is one aspect of economic justice which fulfills the claims of social justice. The negative aspect of this, which in modern times we understand, is no work, no pay. So you have several decisions of the highest court of this land, wherein the principle of no work, no pay has been applied. That is also an aspect of social, because we are talking about fair rewards for the productive activities of individuals. Fair rewards for the productive activities of individuals. If someone doesn't work, you cannot simply go on giving him salaries or wages. Fine. So economic justice is understood as part of social justice as long as there are opportunities for meaningful employment and there is dispensation of fair rewards for productive work. So the customary distinction between economic justice and social justice is intellectually unsatisfactory, as they say, because as it serves to legitimize the dichotomization of economic justice and social sphere. Now, Richard Posner's claim of law fulfilling the economic aspect of law in terms of profit and loss, in terms of reward. He also, there's a deal between people when they enter into a contract. There's a deal between the lawmaker and the person who elects the lawmaker, the people and the elected body. The people elect and get the law what they want. There's an economic deal in that sense. Now, that would mean a dichotomy between economic justice and social justice. Therefore, it is stated that we must not limit the implication of economic, the analysis of social justice only to economic perspective. This tendency can seriously limit, because we have to achieve the potential of every law should be to achieve advancement of justice. Fine. Now, in order to acknowledge the necessity of viewing economic justice as an element of social justice, it is important that we concentrate on the social perspective of human affairs. Excuse me. So economic justice is one among many interrelated dimensions of life in society. No doubt, without economic activity in a society, man cannot fulfill all of his aspirational goals of living in a society. But there are also certain philanthropical, charitable activities. So to purely consider social justice from a social perspective, it is necessary that social justice must be also considered from an economic justice perspective. Because the growing disparities, what we fail to understand is, in present day time, the present context, there are growing disparities in the distribution of income and assets, especially aftermath the globalization. Earlier it happened aftermath the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution, Second World War, the centralization of the concept of social justice in all democratic governments, and now the Industrial Revolution, the globalization, impact of LPG post 1990 has created a vast disparity in the distribution of income and assets. Therefore, the direct link between socio-economic class and access to quality education or health or participation in public life is all are indications of social justice. Let us come to another important discourse which is now going on concerning the United Nations generally. Whether social justice is part of the human rights, propagation of human rights. If you have seen the development of human rights pre and post forming of the United Nations, we find that the evolution of United Nations marked the beginning of international justice, especially through the instruments of conventions, especially through the human rights instruments. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in its preamble, states that the highest aspiration of the common people is the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from fear and want and associates, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of human family, with freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So essentially, there was no specific mention about social justice. There was only mention of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So human rights efforts focused on the United Nations efforts focused on human rights for the individual, while the work on development and social justice concentrates on what? On society and on international cooperation for development. So the pursuit of social justice, which involved efforts to achieve greater equality in the living conditions of different social groups and classes, required the active participation of public authorities. What it gradually realized, the human rights movement led by the United Nations, what it gradually realized is that without concentrating on social groups and classes who form the basic targets of human rights protection, you cannot speak about fulfillment of human rights without talking about social justice. So there was a realization in this aspect. So what we find is the respect for human rights implies that there is an obligation on public authorities. The obligation on public authorities is on creating an environment wherein there is a possibility for citizens to protect themselves from the authorities in case of violation of human rights. Traditional moral prescriptions like given in the Bible and other holy documents, thou shalt not kill, neither thou shalt thou bear false witness against any neighbor, are human rights principles stated in the negative. Social justice calls for positive and deliberate action. So the essential distinction that I am trying to make out here between human rights propagation and propagation social justice, whereas human rights propagation is a direction to the states and its authorities not to create an environment where an individual is not allowed to live freely, enjoying equal rights, and there is no discrimination. But the propagation of social justice requires that there is a deliberate action, a positive action on the authorities to undertake such measures in terms of the law to propagate these values. Yeah. Next. Now, how do we reconcile this? Reconciling social justice and human rights. We find this reconciliation taking place later on, not at the initial documents. So in the words of United Nations former Secretary General Boutros Ghali, when this Copenhagen Declaration was made, he says a new social contract at the global level reflecting a sense of solidarity within nations and between nations. In the Copenhagen Declaration made in 1995, there was a specific declaration on the pursuit of social justice and development, which should not be separated from the recognition and promotion of human rights. So what I am trying to emphasize here is, when the United Nations was initially formed, the emphasis was on only protection of human rights, with a direction to the states not to impact human rights. But now, with the specific adoption of this Copenhagen Declaration, there is a direction that there must be a pursuit of social justice and development, which should not be separated from the recognition and promotion of human rights. So the Secretary General observes that social problems which once could be confined within the borders now spread across the world, once considered to be the exclusive responsibility of national governments. These problems now of global scale are of now a global scale and require global attention. So this particular emphasis by the former United Nations Secretary General Boutros Ghali is an admission that social problems or social justice in specifically is not now only limited to national governments. These problems are now related to do at the global scale. These must be tackled at the global scale, which require global attention. So the Copenhagen Declaration has many such references to social justice and justice, which is unqualified in the latter sense, but generally reflected the concept of just societies, to equity and equality, and to inequities and inequalities that must be redressed. So this declaration is a specific mandate on the states to tackle inequities and inequalities. An ethical and spiritual vision for social development is what emerges from the Copenhagen Declaration. What we find here is that the declaration at the Copenhagen meet was perceived against the global inequalities that were growing. So the idea was that in order for a just society to prevail, this just society is not a society of only production and consumption. It is not only a society to achieve better standard of living condition, but it must be a society to reduce relative poverty. And they must also pursue such programs of employment, social integration, including all dimensions of equality between women and men. For health purpose, for education for all. Essentially, what Copenhagen Declaration did was, there was a mandate that governments must respond more effectively to the material and spiritual needs of individuals, their families, and their communities. What we understand here is, despite of course the critical part of Copenhagen Declaration is that after the Copenhagen Declaration, nothing very specifically came about in terms of doing anything for the promotion of social justice. Let's move on now to summarize my discussion for the day before we move on to the next topic. Now, the questions that I asked insofar as the social justice, the concept of social justice is concerned is, what is the conversation? When did it begin? What are the claims of social justice? Whether social justice includes or is part of distributive justice, or whether social justice is part of economic justice, whether you can achieve economic justice without achieving social justice, and how at the international level slowly social justice is now being recognized as an important part of protection of human rights. So when you try to answer questions of social justice, we need to understand that what are the principles which provide a starting point for the pursuit of social justice. What is the point from where which helps us to start answer the questions of social justice? How broadly should the laws encompass? How broadly the law should compass, include, or extend in pursuit of social change, in pursuit of social justice? And the related question as to how law can how social justice can relate to culture, technology, etc., and how legal power can empower social justice. So therefore, we now come to the conclusion that the central goal of social justice is the desire to promote equality. So equality is the starting point in all legal principles drafted to achieve social justice. As it is said by the ancient Greeks, one of the philosophers quotes, in this world, justice only comes into question between equals. The strong do what they can, and the weak accept what they must. So that is the premise on which the conception of social justice is built to promote equality. Of course, no doubt, John Rawls tried to build a theory of justice which balances the principle of equality with the principle of liberty. So Rawls looks at the starting point as the principle of liberty. But the problem with John Rawls' theory, or the starting point was the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance, meaning that a person before, an authority before making rules, distributing resources, must be in a very objective position without knowing where exactly he will be placed in the society. So therefore, in such a condition, he is going to adopt a principle which would be called as fair, justice as fairness. However, not many people appreciated this, especially Amartya Sen in his idea of justice rejects this. That is one. Another starting point made by Bentham is the what do you call that? Concern for the greatest number, maximum happiness of the maximum number of people. But even here we find that the maximum happiness of the maximum people still leaves behind a minor section of the society who may still not be happy at all. Social justice means even even the minutest, even when you make a difference, even the least disadvantage must be in an advantageous position. So what we find here is that the starting point of social justice should always be the question of equality. I explained to that equality of rights, equality of opportunities, equity in living conditions. And the second second question that he claims, or how much, who all, that is the breadth of change. The goal of equality, first of all, is not limited to any one individual, one section of the society. The goal of equality implies redistribution of resources, not only between different classes, but also between groups who are structurally disadvantaged. In a country like India, for example, structurally disadvantaged women, caste, etc., age. So we can say sex, race, caste, age, etc. These are who are structurally disadvantaged. So when you talk about the breadth of change, whom all should it impact? It should include all kinds, all, male, female, this gender, that gender, third gender, caste, etc. So when you consider the breadth of change, again, let me go back to Dr. Ambedkar's contribution in this regard, wherein he said the breadth of change should include in such a manner that caste discrimination are avoided. Women's rights also must be included. Jyotiba Phule or many other social reformers included women within the breadth of social change. Within the breadth of social change, they included women. They included the lower strata of the society. And now, in the present context, law, culture, and technology also could become the starting points of fulfilling of social justice. Especially in a multicultural society, a pluralistic society. the legal culture that the society develops. In India, for example, we have a legal culture wherein the legal institution in India, the apex code in India, through its decisions, is establishing a socially just order. Whether it is a judgment in the Puttaswamy case, Aadhaar judgment, whether it is the judgment on the entry of women to temples, whether it is the illegality of decision on illegality of triple talaq, etc., etc. We find that the legal culture in a society helps to promote social justice. One also should not forget the impact of technology, because technology is now playing an important role in legal profession and the society itself. In the high technology culture of the 21st century, the law will face challenges. The challenges of the law, the answer to the challenges of law, as someone said, cannot be found in the lexicon of Latin maxims. What are the challenges of law that we are facing today? How law should promote social justice in an era of capital-intensive economic development. How law should promote social justice in an economic development which is at the cost of high social cost, acquisition of land, displacement of person, degradation of forest, acquisition of forest land, etc. That is one aspect. So tomorrow, these questions will be thrown at the courts. Questions people will ask. When the capital-intensive economic development fails in providing employment, when the capital-intensive economic development will disturb the environment, the living environment. Furthermore, we find that the administration of law in this particular computer age should be simpler. Access to justice. Access to justice is also part of social justice. Access to land titles, etc. So technology here in the today's context has an important role to play to fulfill the claims of social justice of equality. We are going to have a data privacy law. How the data privacy law could pervade the privacy of an individual. How it could be prevented from its exploitation. So these are all aspects which I think are important in furthering our question of social justice. Furthermore, we have a legal power and a moral power, legal power and the moral order. We consider that law is a potential vehicle for the promotion of social justice. It is necessary to consider, therefore, the relation between legal power and other kinds of power in any society. And in this regard, let me take a quote from Max Weber, who outlines 3 bases of power in bringing about, this is important in the context of bringing about social justice, social change or social justice in particular. So Max Weber outlines 3 bases of power: charismatic power, traditional power, and legal rational power. A charismatic power refers to the extraordinary quality of a person, regardless of whether this quality is actual, alleged, or presumed. Charismatic power is not managed according to general norms, which are either traditional or rational. Most of the time, charismatic power is revolutionary, sometimes irrational, but sometimes revolutionary. For example, when governments say, okay, we'll give you free rice, free this, free electricity, or such slogans are made. On such power being used, that person becomes charismatic. That also could bring about social justice. You know what's happening around Indian political culture these days. That's an example. Traditional power refers to the accepted set of subordination or super subordination. Traditional power refers to the relation between day-to-day relations between individuals. That is also an aspect of social justice. Relation between husband and wife, father and son, etc. So family individual relations also go a long way in furthering social justice. Legal rational power, which is embodied in our administrative system. So legal rational power, the rationalization of the application of law is also an important aspect to fulfill the social justice. When all these power, charismatic power, traditional power, or the legal and moral power are synthesized into an acceptable authority, for example, the constitution or a legislation, we can expect the fulfillment of social justice. Unless all these powers are synthesized, for example, when we spoke about removal of untouchability or certain practices in certain religions, whether it is Hindu, whether it is a case of sati, whether it is a case of talaq, or when we speak about codification of Hindu law, or when the courts speak about right of equality of women, etc. We are speaking about synthesis of all this power, which ultimately comes out in the form of bringing about social change and thereby fulfilling social justice. Let me conclude here on the aspect of question of social justice by submitting that social justice is an aspirational goal. The questions of social justice are now to be answered in a legal manner, in an institutional manner, though it was developed more as a moral philosophy, virtue, or certain conduct. But now, with so many other injustices in the society, based upon gender, based upon caste, based upon class, we find that the conception of justice has to be broadened. The breadth of change, the breadth of inclusion of justice should include social justice for coming times. Now coming to the second part of the lecture, or the last part of the lecture, in about 10 minutes, I know that several research scholars, resource persons previously have spoken about this, but let me anyhow, since the topic mentions, let me also speak about it. Insofar as the contemporary trends in legal research, in the context of the topic that I just now discussed, in the 1960s and 70s and later on up to the 80s or 90s, we found that the trend in legal research related to concentrating on various aspects of social justice, social welfare, because by then we had plethora of laws fulfilling the mandate of the governments. Several social welfare legislations to bring about social change were made. So the legal research concentrated on a doctrinal kind of research on issues such as dowry, issues related to women in general, issues related to child welfare, bonded labor, child labor, social discrimination, etc. Then what we find is that post 1990s, or very specifically for the past 10 to 15 years, we find that there are monumental changes in law, in the development of law, and the legal tools also have changed. The trend has been greater now, or more significant developments in legal information because of the new technology. A legal researcher cannot ignore this, whoever it is. whether it is established academicians or whether it is young teachers or researchers. For law to keep in tune with social change, it is necessary that law must take notice of the developments happening around it. So what we find is that there are several changes, such as social and behavioral science in the development of solutions to legal problems. Legal researcher must enter the social field. He is now to consider the behavioral patterns. The world of information, legal information, is in a state of continuous influx. Technology has made that possible. There is an opportunity for a legal researcher to now concentrate on several aspects. The information technology law, the artificial intelligence, the developments going on in the biotechnology, the problems caused in the society due to COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on the livelihoods of certain sections of our society, be it domestic workers, be it migrant workers, the new challenges to rights, gender rights, and such other developments that are taking place. The trend now is for legal research to be meaningful, to make a cross-discipline study. That's the trend. A cross-discipline study in the sense that, now let me clarify this. I know some other resource person would discuss or has already discussed. It is now fancy to talk about interdisciplinary research. But before we understand what is interdisciplinary research, we must also know there are terms which are similar to interdisciplinary: cross-discipline, transdiscipline, intradiscipline. Many of research scholars attempting to do Ph.D. come with such ideas. Well, broadly understood, a discipline which crosses the boundary of the discipline of law is cross-discipline or interdiscipline. Apart from law, law's interaction with other social sciences, with economics, with political science, with environmental science, etc., with biotechnology, is a cross-disciplinary research. Let me also warn you that an interdisciplinary research requires the skills to understand the nature of the other discipline. Like it is said, law itself is a philosophical, law is a philosophical subject. So how does philosophy of law, or jurisprudence of law, knowledge about law, synthesize with knowledge about other social sciences? What is happening in a particular field of social science, economics, for example? We find that the economic development in our country or world over is now concentrating in producing more wealth to some, thereby taking away wealth from someone else. The degradation of the natural environment. So how the discipline of law will understand the discipline of economics, whether the researcher has this necessary skill. So we need to train up the finer concepts in other subjects, in economics, in environmental science, in maybe biology, in other subjects such as political science. So friends, let me conclude here by stating that questions of social justice cannot be answered in a static condition of society. Society progresses. Society changes changes, bringing different variables. So if you say you have evolved into one conception of social justice, you must know that this conception of social justice will change very dramatically because of the change in the human elements constituting it. No one spoke about the rights of the other gender some 20 years back. Now we are trying to include. No one spoke about a live-in relationship some 20 years back. Now it is a common phenomenon. No one spoke about, though there was a law, the conditions of migrant workers, though there was a law in 1976. The COVID-19 made it very specific. No one spoke about domestic servants and their rights some 20, 30 years back. Now they do. So when we derive a parameter for the concept of social justice, we must understand ultimately the parameters of social justice can be, the starting point for the parameter of social justice is a desire to promote equality, a breadth of change to include all segments of society, and a solution which is not individually concentrating on that particular society, but the entire universe. Thank you very much.